Thanks, everyone. Glad I could be here today. Shout out to Scott for giving me an opportunity to tell you a little bit about what it is that I've been doing lately in sales. And so what I'm hoping to speak with you guys today is about prescriptive selling, which is leading your prospective customers through the buying process. And there's a slight but very important change here in this mindset, which is that we're not leading people through our sales cycle or our sales process, but we're guiding people through their buying process. Now, we've all heard this oft-repeated statistic that by the time that a customer or prospect speaks to you for the first time, they're already 70% of the way through the buying process. We've heard it time and time again. Some people say it's 58%. The numbers really don't matter, but the point is that people have information that they've never really had access to at any point in their entire life, in their decision-making process. And back in 2015, being the introspective person that I am, or strive to be at least, I had an epiphany about what this really meant for me as a salesperson. And this happened actually before a client dinner, not during, not even after. And so I was in Orlando back in 2015, and I was choosing a restaurant to meet with my client. So it wasn't my city, not from Orlando. I'm actually from Toronto originally. And I knew that I could count on Yelp, OpenTable, Foursquare, TripAdvisor, Google Reviews. I had so many different resources that I had access to. And I knew this is not going to really be a big deal. So I opened up my laptop. It's around 6 o'clock, dinner's at 8. Go to Yelp, first thing that I do. I love steak. So I started checking out steak houses. About 5 minutes later, I was like, okay, that seems kind of cool. Then I went on TripAdvisor. Started looking at steak houses on TripAdvisor. Then I was like, okay, well, there's a slightly bad rating here. This guy last week said he absolutely hated it. So let me check out Google Reviews. And then you go on Google Reviews. It looks way too anonymous. You're like, who is Bob 4444? It's like, should I even trust him? And so 30 minutes later, I still hadn't picked a restaurant. And I was dumbfounded as to how that was even possible, because now more than ever, I had access to such a breadth of information. And so when that happened to me, I thought to myself, well, if I'm struggling this much to make a decision that has implications for only a couple of hours for a couple $100, how difficult is it for my prospects to make a decision that could cost them thousands or even millions of dollars and last multiple years? I was like, damn. For the first time, I put myself in an empathetic position of understanding exactly what it is to be in the crux of that decision-making table. And when I did that, I came to the realization that the age of information, as we call it, has actually left us far more confused than equipped to make a decision. And that selection of a restaurant was merely a microcosm for the types of decisions that our prospects have to make every single day when we interact with them. And so I spent the next 2 or 3 weeks after my trip reviewing my deals from the past 2 years, trying to identify how could this have manifested itself in my results. And as I did that, took a look through Salesforce, and I looked at my deal lost reasoning. I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with this. And the number one thing that stood out was lost to no decision. I wasn't losing to a competitor. People sound like, people can resonate with this. And as I did that, I was like, okay, I started to analyze each individual loss and each individual win. And as I did that, I made a table. And this is some of the results and the insights that I came away with. In the losses, I followed the typical sales process, from discovery to demo to qualification, every single step that you can think of, all the way through. I educated my customers, just like the Challenger sale told me to. I gave them tons and tons of information on anything that they wanted to know. I was an expert in my industry. I was pretty generic. I wanted to have an opportunity to have deeper discovery with people, But at the onset, I gave them an overview so they could really buy into what it is that we were doing. I tried to turn their interest into a very strong desire to act. I asked them, how would you measure the success of this project or this initiative? And lastly, the underlying common denominator was I was liked. People liked me. They smiled when they saw me. They were eager and happy to answer the phone if I called. If I got on a plane to meet with them, I could take them out to a game. They'd sit and have a 3-hour-long dinner conversation with me. And that was all great. But when I juxtaposed that against what was transpiring in my wins, it was very different. The deals that I had won, I led and directed the buying cycle. I outlined meticulously every detail, every step, every consideration, obstacle, risk that was intrinsic in the process. I provided insight. And to delineate the difference between an insight and education, this is basically the way that I'll say it. Insight is what creates those aha moments, those breakthroughs that people have. And when you create enough of those within the context of a sales process, within the broader scope of a defined process, you can start to drive people towards action. The third thing that I did was I categorized and tailored my approach. I identified where people were not only in their buying cycle, but in their situation as an organization. I created a project. I formalized. This was not just, Jim, I'm glad that you took this conversation with us, and looking forward to speaking with you and seeing where this goes. It was, Jim, if you decide to continue this conversation, there's a formalized approach that we're going to follow. And that approach encompasses these particular steps, will require this buy-in from these folks, and this is how it's going to be measured. I prescribed the ideal outcome. I stopped relying, and this may sound counterintuitive, I stopped relying on what my customers were telling me were important for them to measure. And I focused on, you know what, I'm an expert in this. And I've worked with over 50 different clients, and if you want to be successful, this is what an organization like yours should be aiming to accomplish. And the difference here in the end was I was respected. Hopefully people like me, but they definitely respected me. And to sum that all up, I think it's about helping people, your customers, buy rather than trying to sell towards them. And this brings me to my next point, which is these are the 6 steps that I started to follow and implement over the next 3 years that allowed me to continually grow my results and ultimately surpass my quota. And so I'll go through them as an outline. The first one, outline the buying cycle and lead them through it. The second step, get them to bucket themselves. Create a collaborative project. Deliver insights to earn respect and inspire change. Describe the knockout outcome. And then finally, drive them towards that. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on what each of these steps ultimately entail. When we talk about outlining the buying cycle and leading them through it, of course, you need to consult with your clients as to how do you normally make a software decision or purchase. But for me, what was more important was to say, the customers that I've worked with that have been successful, this is the way that they've evaluated such a solution. And when I prescribed that so methodically, customers were far more willing to opt in to this conversation, this process. In fact, I would literally say, at the end of this call, I'm going to pose a question to you. And we may not be the right fit for each other. But if we are, then we're going to follow this process that I've outlined. And if not, it's all good. I would love to continue the conversation. More than happy to serve you in any other way that I can or direct you to someone else who can help you. But if we're continuing our conversation, this is how it's going to be. Obviously, it can be a bit more nuanced than that, but that's the crux of it. The third thing that I did was identify potential roadblocks to mitigate risks very early on in the process. Normally I see that a decision like this could take 12 months. And one of the main reasons is because your IT team may delay as a result of a security review. That's identifying a roadblock. What we normally do is involve your IT team very early on in the process. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. That one step right there saved me 1 year in a sales cycle for one particular company. The last thing is using this process of outlining the buying cycle allows you to filter low probability opportunities because you're working with people who want to mutually collaborate with you to achieve a common goal. The second step that I would do is get people to bucket themselves. And my leading question or statement was, most of the companies that I speak to will fall into one of these 3 buckets. I'd outline the 3 common scenarios or situations the companies would normally approach us with, and I'd get them to describe their particular situation. And depending on that, my very next step would be, okay, this is a very common situation for us, and what we normally do in this circumstance is this. And I have a prescribed plan right from the initial conversation for how we're going to accomplish that. From there, we move right into formalizing a project. So we've come to the end of our conversation. I hope this has been productive for you. Would you like to continue this conversation? Yes. Okay, great. Remember I told you at the onset that there's a very particular process that we follow? Well, this is what it is. It's almost hilarious in a way because they're agreeing to something without even knowing what it entails. But not once has anyone ever pushed back on me based on that point. And then that concept of a bucket is something that I maintain throughout the entire duration of the sales cycle. The third thing, create a collaborative project. This should not just be something they have interest in. This should be defined. It should be measured. It should be formulated. It should be official from an internal standpoint as well as an external standpoint. And that allows you to identify and involve your stakeholders early. You don't want to be single-threaded in a deal. And this is one of the best ways that I've found to avoid that fall, so to speak, that I've normally encountered when I have one great champion, but I'm not very multi-threaded internally. The second thing is we want to assign responsible owners and deliverables from both sides of the organization. Create a project schedule around that. David mentioned earlier having a close plan. This is basically exactly that. And this is going to be a natural part of the process that you outlined initially. And that's where I thought the biggest insight for me I came away with was this was so easy to do because I had set that consistency and that expectation on the onset of that first conversation. The fourth step, deliver insights to earn respect and also to inspire change. There's this line that my former CEO used to throw out. You can be a peer in the boardroom or a vendor in the hallway. And it's really up to you how you position yourself, how you define your credibility, and being very methodical and prescriptive in this approach is what allowed me to generate higher levels of respect, credibility, and ultimately trust. When I stepped into a room with the CMO and I said, I think that you guys are doing this a suboptimal way. I know it's working for you right now, but here's the optimal way that you should go about doing it. With this process that I've outlined, I've received very little pushback from very seasoned executive leaders. By doing this, you focus less on education and more on insights, those aha moments, those breakthroughs that I mentioned, because that's ultimately what creates excitement. And I think the biggest deal stopper is inertia. Everyone wants to just stay the same. There's too many risks to changing, to unseating the incumbent, to hiring people. And when you create that excitement, those breakthrough moments, you can translate that into action. Now, this is the part of the sales cycle where you can focus on being a challenger, on opening up a world of different beliefs and thought processes that your prospects were not ever familiar with. And I think the key here is that great discovery is the foundation for understanding what breakthroughs and insights will hit home with those prospects. Because you can tailor all of your breakthroughs, your insights around What are the pains that they're suffering from currently? And lastly, and this was something that it actually took me a year after this initial realization to come up with this, was demonstrate the cost of inaction. You know, the traditional approach to an ROI, and I do both just for the, just for transparency, create an ROI that demonstrates you will receive X times multiple based on the initial cost of our solution. I did that. But what I also did as a second component was, this is what you're going to miss out on if you don't act. And that actually is a far more powerful emotional driver than a traditional ROI. At least that's been my experience. The fifth step, describe the knockout outcome. So I may begin a conversation with something like, in terms of this step of the process, let's say we're here a year from now, 12 months from now, we're sitting down in a room, and this has been an absolute knockout for you. What qualitatively or quantitatively would have needed to happen for you to describe the situation as such? And usually that opens up a huge amount of transparency and openness from the client. And then I say, okay, great. This is pretty ambitious, but I think you may be able to do better. Or if you want to accomplish this, because these are very ambitious goals, here's the change management processes that needs to be implemented in order to facilitate this level of success. And that's where we start to remove some of the roadblocks, because selling the deal is one thing, but if you want to create a customer for life, you have to be able to harness that success, that discovery process, into something that is sustainable in the long term. And so after someone signs, you have to make sure that those change managements are in place in order to accomplish that. And then lastly, we want to reiterate the cost of inaction. The sixth and final step is you want to drive them towards action. And this is the step in the process that normally I think causes the most friction, or where deals go to die. They like you. They know there's an ROI there. There's a deep pain point. They know how much it costs. But now is just not the right time. We don't have the resources. We like it, but we need to evaluate whether this will be part of our 2019 strategy. So we've all heard these things pop up. And the way to combat that most successfully that I found is to follow the project schedule that we outlined. Consistency is this really powerful thing whereby if someone said one particular thing 6 months ago, a year ago, that they wanted to be live by July 2018, they're going to do everything that they can in their power to accomplish that. Go back to that and establish a good cadence of that early, because consistency works both ways. I think that the most important conversation in the entire sales process is the very first one that you have. Are you deferential with someone, or are you assertive? Are you leading with credibility, or are you a bit meek in your approach because you're not sure if they're the right fit? And I found that when I established that early cadence of assertiveness, of being prescriptive, of being confident, of having regular correspondence in the very first meeting, you should expect to hear from me every week. And when we get down to the last, let's say, 2 or 3 steps of the process, I'm probably going to schedule a weekly meeting on your calendar. It's going to be a standing meeting, and we're just going to meet at that time. Now, try doing that at the end of the sales process, and you seem really annoying. But if it's something that you've been doing for 6 months or a year, it just becomes a natural part of the interactions that you're having. The third thing, you're now able to cruise around those roadblocks because they've been easily identified. You've had multiple months to plan and take proactive action against how you would solve or resolve any of those outstanding issues. And then lastly, and I think this was really important for me, is that closing became the natural result of a buying cycle. I'm more of an introverted person, so I'm not the guy who's going to be ringing you up on 4:59 p.m. on Friday multiple times, calling you, texting you, emailing you, I'm pretty chill. And that's probably been one of the major gripes that my managers have had. And so I had to figure out a way to combat this. And the way that I did that was following this project schedule and this cadence of being very prescriptive. We're going to accomplish this on this day. If we don't, this is the contingency plan, and this is what I'm going to do to get us back on track. And when I did that, closing was not this big, well, are we going to get this done? Should I send it to you right now, or should I send it to your manager? It just became the natural result of a sales cycle. Questions from anyone?
So what kind of specific strategies do you use to get things back on track? Because as we know, people flake out all the time. So what kind of things have you done? Like you mentioned the contingency plan. I'd be curious about that.
Okay. So there's multiple different things that I've done. Normally it revolves around circling back to why that particular date was important. So we always choose an end date, a date driver, in other words, a compelling event. What is the reason that we're actually working towards this date? And so it's going to be very simply, John, you told me that this was the important date because your legacy system will shut off upon this date. So that's the date that we're working towards. Right now we're behind on schedule. So we need to basically enact everything that we can to ensure that things get back on track. But to your point, Kyle, sometimes things don't get back on track. And I think, it was someone else that mentioned this earlier, I think David, which he said, this is about increasing the chance of, or the probability of winning. And it's basically the same thing. Having a contingency plan, making sure that people stick to their compelling event, and re-emerging that idea around it. It's going to work 40% of the time or 50% of the time, but not all the time. But those small wins or that 40% of the time can be an extra deal or 5 deals during the course of the year.
I'm curious, when you're dealing with huge customers who have their own defined buying process and you come in and talk to them about the way things are going to go, how are you nuanced about that? And then I also am curious about what inspired you to go and analyze your wins and losses, which was really cool. I'm so excited you did that.
Oh, thank you. I think incorporating and meshing both of those things together is really important. I think I divided it into 2 ways. This is the evaluation, and this is the business process that needs to happen concurrently with it. So oftentimes they may be 2 very distinct things. At times in the process they may merge together.
Kind of line them up.
Exactly. And so I'd normally create 2 documents, one Excel document, and one tab would be, in this circumstance, the actual buying cycle, and then the second tab would be their internal process that they need to follow. That's usually only for very complex, larger customers, and most of the time they were fine following the process that I had outlined. Oh, and to your second question, I'm very reflective naturally, so I'm always looking as to, well, what did I do that worked previously? How can I optimize that? And so I thought, well, the only way to learn really from my prior mistakes is to go back and figure out what it is that I could have done better and what I did that worked.
Awesome. Thank you.
Welcome.
Good stuff, Justin. I like how both you guys played off each other in a little bit of like taking control or being transparent about your selling process it's like a Sandler-esque type deal. I'd like to see if you could elaborate a little bit more on this putting people into buckets, because you said I lay out these buckets for my customers and then each one kind of has its own journey or path that I lead them on. I think that's really powerful and could be a really cool thing.
Sure. So an example of the multiple buckets that you could place people in could be something like this. So there's 3 customers or 3 types of prospects that I normally speak with. The first prospect are people who are just starting to research our type of solution, starting to figure things out. They know it's interesting, they know they need to make a change, but this isn't really something that's defined. The second bucket is people who have probably looked at our solution or our competitors for quite some time. They have a good amount of information, you have a defined team, and you're really now ready to get to the nitty-gritty of evaluation. And then the third bucket is people who have budget, you know who all the stakeholders are, you're ready to take action, and you're just trying to evaluate more or less who is the best vendor or partner to work with. Which bucket would you say that you fall under? And then depending on what their response is, then I'm going to tailor a different sales process accordingly.
My question's related to the buckets as well. Your description of the buckets maybe wasn't what I was expecting. I was thinking about buyers sort of for different purposes or different applications potentially. I guess the question is, for us as sellers, it's easy for us to, with a little reflection, imagine what kind of buckets might exist and where people might fit. But I think for a lot of our customers, it's hard for them to put themselves in a bucket, or they feel like they're unique and special and different, and don't want to be in a bucket with anybody else, right? So how do you help them go someplace they might not want to go, right?
For sure. To answer your first question, there's usually two different bucket delineations, so to speak. The first is a situational bucket. This is a situation that you may be a part of, and so that's going to be what product line you should perhaps be pitching, and so forth. What pain points you may be facing or experiencing. The second bucket is the bucket around the maturity of the decision-making process, how far along they are. So I think it's important to generalize and be specific that this is normally what I hear. Which of these would you say that you probably fall into the best? But if you don't think you fall into any of these, describe for me what your situation is.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Doing great. Question for you when you talked about evaluating your wins and losses. So I recently did that, and then I came up with one that was an absolute anomaly where I'm like, shit, I did everything right beyond, because it was my second time trying to get that business. How do you make sense of that? Where do you go forward? Because one of the things I did, I told this customer, you'll see me, but you won't see me for a while. And how do you make that okay? So what do you do with something like that? Because I saw which I loved, but when boy, I really did everything I was supposed to do here, got the teams involved. So how do you rationalize that one?
I think I'm going to piggyback off of what David said earlier, which is everything that we do in sales is merely trying to move people from, I'm going to use my word again, buckets into a different bucket. So what I mean by that is that if you speak to 100 people during the course of a year, prospective clients, you can assume that 20 of those conversations, 20 of those customers are not going to buy from you no matter what you say to them whatsoever. 50 of them, well, they may buy from you, and it's your job to take them into the final bucket, which is people that will buy from you even if you completely mess up regardless. And so I think the purpose that we have as salespeople is to move people from that bucket of 50% in the middle into the last bucket of people who are very highly likely going to purchase from you. But sometimes I just chalk it up to, even LeBron James misses shots sometimes. Not against the Raptors, unfortunately, but he still does miss.
Thank you.
Thank you.